The frozen air cut through Sergeant Viktor Petrov's lungs like broken glass as he crouched behind the skeletal remains of what had once been a textile factory. Stalingrad stretched before him in November 1942, a landscape so thoroughly destroyed it seemed to belong to another planet entirely. Buildings that had once housed families now stood as hollow monuments to artillery fire, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets, staring across a city that had become the world's largest graveyard. Viktor adjusted his position, feeling the cold seep through the 3 layers of clothing he wore, none of them quite adequate for the Russian winter that was settling over the Volga. He was 26 years old, though the gaunt face reflected in the small piece of mirror glass in his pocket looked a decade older. Before the war, he had been a watchmaker in Moscow, a profession that required steady hands and patient eyes, both of which had served him well when his superiors discovered his natural aptitude with a rifle. "Petrov," whispered Corporal Dmitry Sokolov, sliding into position beside him. Dmitry was younger, barely 20, with a farm boy's thick shoulders and a face still round enough to suggest the baby fat of youth hadn't entirely disappeared before the war had stolen his innocence. "The German machine gun nest is 200 meters, maybe 220. 3rd floor of the apartment block, eastern corner." Viktor nodded, bringing his Mosin Nagant rifle to his shoulder. The weapon was standard issue, reliable enough, but its PU scope had been giving him problems for weeks now. The reticle seemed to shift slightly in cold weather, and more than once he had missed shots he knew he should have made. In the brutal mathematics of urban warfare, where a single German machine gun could pin down an entire Soviet platoon, missing wasn't just failure, it was death for his comrades. He peered through the scope, and there it was again, that subtle distortion, like looking through water that wasn't quite still. The crosshairs that should have been crisp appeared slightly doubled, a ghost image that made precise aiming nearly impossible at distances beyond 150 meters. Viktor had reported the problem to his commanding officer 3 times, but replacement scopes were in short supply, and soldiers were expected to make do with what they had. "Can you take the shot?" Dmitry asked, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Viktor studied the target. The German position was well chosen, protected by rubble, and positioned to provide clear lines of fire across the approach to the tractor factory that Soviet forces desperately needed to hold. He could see movement behind the sandbags, the telltale glint of a machine gun barrel. 200 meters with a faulty scope, against a partially concealed target. The mathematics were not in his favor. "I'll try," Viktor said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. He had been a sniper for 8 months now, and in that time he had learned that trying often meant watching men die because your bullet hadn't found its mark. He steadied his breathing, found what he hoped was center mass on the German position, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, the sharp report echoing across the ruins. Through the scope, he saw his bullet strike the sandbags 3 inches to the left of where he had aimed. The German machine gun immediately opened fire, tracer rounds cutting through the grey afternoon like angry hornets. Viktor and Dmitry pressed themselves into the frozen ground as bullets chewed into the rubble around them. Somewhere behind them, Viktor heard screaming. One of the advancing infantry had been hit. "Fall back!" Someone was shouting. "Fall back!" They retreated through the maze of destroyed buildings, the machine gun following them with methodical bursts. By the time they reached the relative safety of Soviet lines, 2 men had been killed and 4 wounded. Viktor felt their deaths like physical weights settling onto his shoulders. That evening, in the basement of a half-collapsed building that served as their temporary barracks, Viktor sat cleaning his rifle by the light of a single candle. Around him, 24 men tried to find warmth and sleep in conditions that would have been considered uninhabitable before the war had reset everyone's expectations of what humans could endure. The smell of unwashed bodies, gangrene, and the ever-present smoke from burning buildings created an atmosphere that made breathing feel like a chore. Captain Anatoly Volkov approached, his boots crunching on broken glass. Volkov was 43, a career officer with a lined face and eyes that had seen too many men die under his command. He carried himself with the weary authority of someone who no longer expected to survive, but continued fighting, because stopping wasn't an option. "Petrov," Volkov said, sitting down on a piece of rubble beside him. I heard about today. The scope is defective, sir, Viktor said quietly. I've reported it multiple times. I know. Volkov pulled out a cigarette, one of the precious few that still circulated in Stalingrad, and lit it with shaking hands that betrayed either cold or stress or both. I've requisitioned a replacement. 3 times. Each time I'm told there are no spare scopes available. The supply lines across the Volga are under constant bombardment, and optical equipment is low priority compared to ammunition and food. Viktor continued cleaning his rifle, not trusting himself to speak. The frustration was like acid in his chest. We have another operation tomorrow, Volkov continued. Same area. Intelligence says the Germans are bringing up reinforcements to that machine gun position. If we don't neutralize it, they'll hold the entire approach to the tractor factory. He took a long drag on his cigarette. I need you to make that shot, Petrov. I know your equipment is faulty. I know I'm asking the impossible. But I need that machine gun silenced. After Volkov left, Viktor sat in the darkness, turning his rifle over in his hands. The Mosin Nagant was a beautiful weapon in its simplicity. Reliable, accurate, powerful. But it was only as good as its optics, and his optics were failing him when he needed them most. Dmitri appeared beside him, carrying 2 small pieces of bread that passed for their evening ration. He handed one to Viktor and sat down. You'll make the shot tomorrow, Dmitri said with the confidence of youth. You're the best shooter in the battalion. Being the best doesn't matter if my equipment fails, Viktor replied. He pulled out the small piece of mirror glass he carried, a memento from his watchmaker's kit that had somehow survived the journey from Moscow to this frozen hell. In the candlelight, he could see his own reflection, and behind it, the distorted view of the scope mounted on his rifle. That's when the idea came to him. It started as barely more than a thought, a memory from his days repairing watches and optical instruments in Moscow. Lenses bent light in predictable ways. If the scope's internal lens had shifted or developed a defect, perhaps it could be compensated for with an additional optical element. The mirror glass he carried was thin but of good quality. If he could position it correctly in the scope's light path, it might correct for the distortion he was seeing. The problem was that modifying military equipment without authorization was strictly forbidden. Soviet regulations were clear. Tampering with weapons could result in court-martial or worse. The reasoning was sound enough. Untrained modifications could make weapons dangerous or unreliable, and in the chaos of war, maintaining standardization was crucial. But Viktor wasn't some farmer pressed into service with no understanding of precision mechanics. He had spent 8 years crafting mechanisms that needed to be accurate to fractions of millimeters. He looked at Dmitri, then back at his rifle. The choice was stark. Continue with a faulty scope and likely miss critical shots, resulting in more Soviet deaths, or risk court-martial by attempting an unauthorized modification that might solve the problem. Viktor made his decision, working through the night by candlelight. His watchmaker's hands moved with practiced precision. First, he carefully disassembled the PU scope, laying out each component on a clean cloth. The scope was simpler than the chronometers he had once repaired, but its internal arrangement was elegant, a series of lenses precisely spaced to provide magnification and a clear reticle. He examined each element carefully, and there it was. The objective lens at the front of the scope had developed a subtle crack, likely from the temperature extremes and rough handling of combat. The crack was almost invisible to the naked eye, but it was enough to create the double image that had been haunting his shots. Replacing the lens was impossible. He had no spare parts, no proper tools, and no workshop. But compensation was possible. Viktor pulled out his mirror glass and studied it in the candlelight. Using a small file from his watchmaker's kit, he began carefully shaping the glass, creating a thin wedge that was thicker on one edge than the other. The work required absolute precision. Too thick, and it would distort the image further. Too thin, and it wouldn't correct the problem. His fingers, stiff from cold and exhaustion, nevertheless moved with the muscle memory of thousands of hours at his workbench in Moscow. Dmitri watched in fascination. "What are you doing?" "Probably getting myself shot," Viktor murmured, not looking up from his work. "But if this works, it might save lives." The mirror glass, once properly shaped, needed to be positioned at precisely the right angle within the scope's tube. Viktor used thread carefully extracted from his uniform to create a mounting system, holding the wedge of glass suspended in front of the damaged objective lens. The angle had to be exact. Even a degree off would ruin the correction. By dawn, his eyes burned from the strain, and his hands trembled from hours of precise work, but the modification was complete. The mirror glass wedge sat suspended within the scope tube, invisible to external observation, but positioned to bend incoming light in a way that would counteract the distortion from the cracked lens. In theory, it should work. In practice, he would find out when his life and the lives of his comrades depended on it. He reassembled the scope and mounted it back on his rifle just as Volkov's voice echoed through the basement. "Move out. Operation begins in 30 minutes. The Soviet assault force assembled in the pre-dawn darkness. 60 men tasked with taking and holding a series of buildings that would provide a stepping stone toward the tractor factory. Viktor and Dmitri took up their position in an observation post 3, stories up in a building that still had most of its walls intact, a luxury in Stalingrad's current state. As grey light began to filter through the smoke that perpetually hung over the city, Viktor set up his rifle on a broken windowsill. The German machine gun nest was 220 meters away, exactly where it had been yesterday. He could see movement behind the sandbags as the Germans prepared for another day of the brutal stalemate that characterized the battle for Stalingrad. Soviet infantry is moving into position. Dmitri whispered beside him, observing through binoculars. 3 minutes until the assault begins. Viktor brought his eye to the scope and his breath caught. The image was clear, perfectly brilliantly clear. The double vision was gone, replaced by a crisp view that showed every detail of the German position. He could see individual sandbags, the pattern of frost on the metal of the machine gun, even the helmet of one of the German soldiers moving behind the fortification. His heart was pounding. The modification had worked, but there was no time to celebrate. He had a shot to make. He found his breathing rhythm slow and steady. The German machine gunner was partially visible, his helmet and shoulders exposed as he adjusted his weapon's position. 220 meters in the cold morning air. Viktor calculated for wind, for the slight downward angle, for the temperature's effect on his ammunition. All the variables that a sniper must account for, now visible through optics that finally showed him the truth of the battlefield. The Soviet assault began with a roar of small arms fire and the crump of mortar rounds. The German machine gun opened up immediately, its distinctive sound cutting through the chaos. Viktor could see the gunner clearly now, his body moving with the rhythm of sustained fire. Viktor exhaled slowly, found the perfect stillness between heartbeats, and squeezed the trigger. Through the scope, he saw the German machine gunner's helmet snap backward. The machine gun went silent. The body slumped forward over the sandbags. "Hit!" Dmitri shouted. "Perfect hit!" But Viktor was already working the bolt action, chambering another round. A second German soldier moved to take over the machine gun. Viktor found him in the scope, made the microscopic adjustments for the new target position, and fired again. Another hit. The second German fell. The Soviet infantry surged forward, taking advantage of the silenced machine gun nest. Within minutes, they had secured the building. The operation that had cost 2 lives yesterday was completed with 0 friendly casualties. As the sun climbed higher over Stalingrad's ruins, Viktor sat back from his rifle, his hands shaking not from cold, but from the relief of knowing his weapon would finally do what he needed it to do. The modification had worked perfectly. The improvised optical correction had transformed his faulty scope into a precision instrument. But relief was quickly replaced by anxiety. He had violated regulations. The modification was unauthorized. If discovered, he could face court-martial, even execution. The Soviet military during wartime had little tolerance for deviation from protocol, regardless of results. Dmitri seemed to read his thoughts. "You saved lives today, Viktor. That has to count for something." "Maybe," Viktor replied, carefully packing away his rifle. "Or maybe I've just delayed my own execution." Over the following days, Viktor's shooting became the subject of quiet conversation among the battalion. Shot after shot that would have been difficult with perfect equipment, he was now making routinely with his modified scope. A German officer at 280 meters, an enemy sniper at 310, a machine gun crew at 250. His hit rate, which had been declining with his scope's deterioration, suddenly tripled. Captain Volkov noticed. On the 5th day after the modification, he called Viktor to his makeshift command post, a reinforced cellar that offered protection from the constant artillery bombardment. "Petrov," Volkov said, studying him with those tired, knowing eyes, "your performance has improved dramatically. I'm pleased but also curious. The scope I keep requesting still hasn't arrived, yet suddenly you're shooting like you have the finest German optics." Viktor's mouth went dry. This was it, the moment where his unauthorized modification would either be accepted or punished. He made a decision, honesty. "Sir, I modified the scope," he said clearly. "I used mirror glass and thread to correct a defect in the objective lens. The modification is entirely my own design and violates regulations regarding tampering with military equipment. I take full responsibility." Volkov was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "Show me." Viktor carefully removed the scope from his rifle and, with precise explanations that drew on his watchmaker's knowledge, demonstrated how the mirror glass wedge corrected the optical distortion. He explained the principles of light refraction, the mathematics of lens correction, the exact angles required for the modification to work. Volkov listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed he was following the technical explanation, despite having no background in optics. When Viktor finished, the captain sat back and lit one of his precious cigarettes. "You realize I should have you arrested," Volkov said finally. "Yes, sir. You violated regulations. You modified military equipment without authorization. In wartime, such actions are considered serious offenses." Volkov took a long drag on his cigarette, then fixed Viktor with a piercing stare. "They're also exactly the kind of initiative that wins battles." Viktor blinked in surprise. "The Germans are not winning this war because they have better soldiers," Volkov continued. "They're winning because they encourage their men to think, to adapt, to solve problems creatively. We Soviets are excellent at following orders, at sacrifice, at endurance. But sometimes I think we've forgotten how to improvise." He gestured at the modified scope. "This is improvisation. This is a soldier seeing a problem and fixing it, rather than waiting for someone else to do it for him." "What happens now, sir?" Viktor asked. "Now?" Volkov smiled grimly. "Now I have some decisions to make. Get some rest, Petrov, and keep that rifle ready. We'll need you again soon." 2 days later, Viktor was summoned to a meeting that included not just Captain Volkov, but also Major Konstantin Reznikov, the battalion's political officer, and Lieutenant Yevgeny Ivanov, who served as the unit's weapons specialist. Viktor entered the room with his heart hammering, certain that the presence of the political officer meant his court-martial was imminent. Instead, Reznikov gestured to a chair. "Sit, Sergeant Petrov. Captain Volkov has told us about your scope modification." Viktor sat, keeping his expression neutral. Reznikov was known as a hard man, a true believer in Soviet doctrine, who had sent men to their deaths for smaller infractions than unauthorized equipment modifications. "I've examined your work," Lieutenant Ivanov said. The weapons specialist was younger than Viktor, perhaps 24, with the enthusiastic energy of someone who genuinely loved the technical aspects of warfare. "It's remarkable. Crude in execution, perhaps, but the optical principles are sound. The mirror glass acts as a corrective element, compensating for the defect in the objective lens. It's actually quite elegant. The question before us," Reznikov said, "is whether this represents commendable initiative or dangerous insubordination." He pulled out a file and opened it. "Regulations are clear. Unauthorized modifications to weapons are forbidden. The penalty can be severe." Viktor felt sweat forming on his back despite the cold. This was it. "However," Reznikov continued, and Viktor's breath caught at that single word, "regulations also recognize that wartime conditions require adaptation. Captain Volkov has made a compelling argument that your modification has directly resulted in successful operations and saved Soviet lives. Major General Rodimtsev himself has taken interest in this matter." The mention of the division commander's name made Viktor's stomach drop. Rodimtsev was a legendary figure, a hero of the Soviet Union, a man whose opinions carried enormous weight. "Lieutenant Ivanov," Reznikov said, turning to the weapons specialist, "is this modification reproducible? Could it be taught to others?" Ivanov nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. Sergeant Petrov's background as a watchmaker gave him the necessary skills, but the principles could be taught to anyone with basic training in optics and access to the right materials. The key is understanding how to shape the corrective element and position it at the proper angle within the scope tube. And the materials? Reznikov asked. Can they be obtained in our current circumstances? Mirror glass is available, Ivanov replied. The Germans have destroyed half the city, but that means there are thousands of buildings with broken mirrors, windows, glass of all kinds. Thread for mounting is standard issue. The main requirement is precision in shaping and positioning the glass, which requires skill and time. Reznikov closed the file and looked directly at Viktor. Sergeant Petrov, Major General Rodimtsev has made a decision. Your modification, while technically unauthorized, has proven its value. Rather than face court-martial, you will instead be assigned to work with Lieutenant Ivanov to develop this technique into a standardized procedure that can be taught to other snipers whose scopes have developed defects. Viktor's relief was so intense it almost made him dizzy. Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you. See that you don't, Reznikov said. But understand this. You're being given this opportunity because your initiative served the Soviet Union. Had your modification failed, had it endangered others, we would be having a very different conversation. You gambled with your life and your freedom. This time you won. Don't make a habit of it. Over the next 3 weeks, Viktor worked with Lieutenant Ivanov to document the modification procedure. They created detailed diagrams showing how to shape the corrective glass, how to calculate the proper wedge angle based on the type of defect present, how to mount it securely within the scope tube. It was meticulous work, requiring Viktor to articulate techniques that had been intuitive to him as a trained watchmaker. They tested the procedure on 5 different rifles with various scope defects. Not all defects could be corrected with the mirror glass method. Some were too severe or involved mechanical rather than optical problems. But in cases where the issue was a cracked or slightly misaligned lens, the modification proved effective in every test. Word of the technique spread through the sniper units in Stalingrad. Dmitri, who had been watching Viktor's back since they arrived in the city, became one of the first to learn the procedure. His own scope had been developing problems, and with Viktor's guidance, he successfully created his own modification, improving his effective range by nearly 80 meters. It's strange, Dmitri said one evening, as they cleaned their rifles in the relative warmth of a basement command post. A few weeks ago, you were worried about being shot for this. Now they're making you teach it to everyone. Viktor smiled grimly. The Soviet Union is like that. Do something unauthorized and succeed, you're a hero. Do the same thing and fail, you're a traitor. The difference is often just luck. I don't think it was luck, Dmitri countered. You're a brilliant craftsman. You saw a problem and solved it. That's not luck, that's skill, perhaps, Viktor thought. But skill alone wasn't enough in war. Timing mattered. Context mattered. If he had attempted this modification a month earlier or a month later, if different officers had been in command, if the battle for Stalingrad had been going differently, any of these factors might have changed everything. On the 31st day after Viktor's initial modification, Major General Rodimtsev visited the battalion's position. He was a compact man with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen more combat than most soldiers would experience in 10 lifetimes. His presence brought every soldier to attention. Sergeant Petrov, Rodimtsev said, after Volkov had provided a briefing on the tactical situation. I've read Lieutenant Ivanov's report on your scope modification. I understand you're teaching the technique to other snipers. Yes, sir. We've successfully trained 12 snipers so far, with more scheduled for instruction. Rodimtsev nodded. The High Command has taken interest in your work. We are losing snipers, not because they lack skill, but because their equipment fails under these conditions, and replacement parts are scarce. Your solution is practical and can be implemented with materials available in the field. He paused, studying Viktor with those penetrating eyes. I'm recommending that your technique be incorporated into standard sniper training throughout the Red Army. You'll be sent to the training center at Saratov to teach the procedure to instructors, who will then disseminate it to units across all fronts. Viktor felt a mixture of pride and unease. Pride that his improvisation was being recognized at such a high level, but unease at leaving Stalingrad, leaving Dmitri and the men he had fought alongside for months. "Sir," Viktor said carefully, "I'm honored, but I would prefer to remain with my unit. There's still work to be done here." Rodimtsev's expression softened slightly. "I understand your loyalty to your comrades, Sergeant, but your value now extends beyond this battlefield. The technique you developed could save hundreds of lives across multiple fronts. That's where you can make the greatest contribution to victory." He stepped closer, his voice dropping so only Viktor could hear. "Besides, Stalingrad is almost over. We're winning here. The Germans are trapped, and it's only a matter of time before they surrender or die. You've done your part in this battle. Let others finish it, while you help prepare for the battles to come." 2 weeks later, Viktor found himself on a transport aircraft, flying east across the Volga, leaving behind the ruins of Stalingrad for the first time in 4 months. Dmitri had clasped his hand before he left, promising to survive the rest of the battle and find him when it was over. The training center at Saratov was a different world from the frozen hellscape of Stalingrad. There were intact buildings, regular meals, beds with blankets, and most miraculous of all, warmth. Viktor met with senior instructors and demonstrated his technique dozens of times, explaining the optical principles, showing how to shape the corrective glass, teaching the precise positioning required for success. The instructors were skeptical at first. Many had decades of experience and weren't thrilled about learning techniques from a sergeant barely 2 years in service. But when they saw the results, the dramatic improvement in accuracy with modified scopes, their skepticism transformed into enthusiasm. "This changes everything," said Colonel Mikhail Gregorov, the center's chief instructor. He was a veteran of the First World War, a man who had been teaching marksmanship longer than Viktor had been alive. "We've always treated optical equipment as something you either have in good condition or you don't. The idea that a skilled soldier can repair or improve his own optics in the field, it gives us flexibility we've never had before." Over 3 months, Viktor trained 48 instructors in the technique. Each of them would go on to train hundreds of snipers across the Red Army. The ripple effect was exactly what Rodimtsev had predicted. A single improvisation made in desperate circumstances in Stalingrad was changing how the entire Soviet military approached scope maintenance and field repair. Letters arrived from Dmitri occasionally, carrying news from Stalingrad. The German 6th Army had surrendered in February 1943, just as Rodimtsev had predicted. The battle was over, and the Soviet Union had won its first major victory of the war. Dmitri had survived and been promoted to sergeant. He wrote that several snipers in the battalion were using modified scopes based on Viktor's technique, and their improved performance had contributed to the final push that broke German resistance. In April 1943, Viktor was awarded the Order of the Red Star for his innovative contribution to Soviet military effectiveness. The ceremony was held at the training center, with Colonel Gregorov pinning the medal to his chest while dozens of trainees watched. "Sergeant Petrov," Gregorov said during the ceremony, "you've demonstrated that initiative and technical expertise are as valuable as courage in combat. You saw a problem that was costing Soviet lives, and rather than accepting it as inevitable, you used your skills to solve it. That is the spirit we need to defeat fascism." After the ceremony, Viktor stood alone for a moment, holding the medal and thinking about the strange path that had brought him here. He had been a watchmaker, then a soldier, then a sniper, and now somehow he had become the man who changed how the Red Army trained its marksmen. All because of one desperate night in a frozen basement, one unauthorized modification made with stolen glass and a broken mirror. The following week, Viktor received new orders. He was being sent to the front again, but this time as a sniper instructor, attached to a guards rifle division preparing for summer operations. His job would be to train snipers in the field, teach the scope modification technique, and continue developing methods to improve marksmanship under combat conditions. Before leaving Saratov, he wrote a letter to Dmitri, who was still in Stalingrad helping with reconstruction efforts. In it, he tried to put into words what the past months had taught him. "My friend, I've learned that war is not just about courage or sacrifice, though those are important. It's also about adaptation, about seeing problems and fixing them rather than accepting defeat. The modification I made to my scope was born from desperation, But it succeeded because I refused to accept that there was no solution. I think perhaps that's what will win this war. Not just our willingness to die for the motherland, but our willingness to think, to improvise, to find solutions where none seem to exist. Stay safe, Dmitri. When this war is over, come find me in Moscow. I'll have a watchmaker's shop again, and I'll teach you the trade. It's a good life, working with your hands to create precision and beauty. And maybe, after all this death, we'll have earned the right to spend our days building things instead of destroying them. Viktor returned to combat in June 1943, attached to a Guards division preparing for the Battle of Kursk. The experience was different now. He was no longer just another sniper trying to survive. He was an instructor, a specialist, someone whose knowledge had value beyond his individual marksmanship. He trained 24 snipers in his division, teaching them not just the scope modification technique, but the broader philosophy it represented, that soldiers should be thinking, adapting, problem-solving rather than just following orders. The war continued for 2 more years. Viktor survived Kursk, survived the push westward through Ukraine and Poland, survived all the way to Berlin. Along the way, he encountered dozens of snipers using variations of his scope modification technique. Some had refined it further, finding new ways to correct different types of optical defects. The improvisation he had made in Stalingrad had evolved into a whole field of practical optics, adapted for combat conditions. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Viktor found himself in Berlin, standing in the ruins of the Reichstag, surrounded by Soviet soldiers celebrating victory. He thought about the journey from Moscow to Stalingrad to Berlin, about the desperate young sergeant who had gambled his life on an unauthorized modification because he couldn't bear to keep missing shots that cost his comrades their lives. Dmitri had survived too, and they reunited in Moscow that summer. True to Viktor's promise, he opened a small watchmaker's shop and Dmitri became his apprentice. They worked together, creating and repairing timepieces, using the same skills of precision and patience that had once been applied to scopes and rifles. One afternoon in 1947, a young soldier entered the shop. He was barely 20, with the nervous energy of someone trying to adjust to peacetime after years of war. "Are you Viktor Petrov?" the young man asked. "The one who developed the scope modification technique?" Viktor looked up from the pocket watch he was repairing and nodded. "I am. Can I help you?" "I wanted to thank you," the soldier said. "I was a sniper in the war's final year. They taught us your technique during training. My scope developed a crack during the battle for Vienna, and I was able to repair it using the method you created. It probably saved my life and the lives of men in my unit." He paused, emotional. "They told us you were a hero, that you'd revolutionized how snipers maintained their equipment. I just wanted to shake your hand." After the young veteran left, Dmitri smiled at Viktor. "A hero who revolutionized sniper training. That's quite a legacy." Viktor returned to his work on the pocket watch, adjusting tiny gears with the same precision he had once used to position mirror glass in a rifle scope. "I was just a soldier trying to solve a problem," he said quietly. The real heroes were the ones who kept fighting even when their equipment failed them, who charged German machine guns knowing they might die. "I just made it a little easier for some of them to survive." "That's why it matters," Dmitri replied. "Anyone can be brave for a moment. It takes a different kind of courage to look at the tools you're given, decide they're not good enough, and fix them. You didn't just modify a scope, Viktor. You changed how the entire army thought about equipment and adaptation. That's the legacy, not the medal or the recognition, but the idea that soldiers should be thinking, problem-solving people, not just following orders blindly." In the years that followed, the technique Viktor developed in that frozen Stalingrad basement became a standard part of Soviet sniper training and eventually influenced military training programs worldwide. The principle was simple. Soldiers should understand their equipment well enough to maintain and even improve it under field conditions. What had started as one desperate sergeant's unauthorized modification became doctrine, studied in military academies and incorporated into weapons training across multiple nations. Viktor never sought fame for his innovation. He ran his watchmaker's shop, trained Dmitri and eventually other apprentices in the precise craft of horology, and gradually let the war recede into memory. But occasionally veterans would find their way to his shop, wanting to thank the man whose improvised solution had saved lives across the Eastern Front. Each time, Viktor would listen politely, accept their gratitude, and then gently redirect the conversation to the present. The war was over. The modification had mattered, had saved lives, had changed how armies trained their marksmen. But that was history now. What mattered was the present. The watch that needed repairing, the apprentice who needed teaching, the small acts of precision and care that made up a meaningful peacetime life. On winter evenings, when snow fell on Moscow and the cold reminded him of Stalingrad, Viktor would sometimes take out the small piece of mirror glass he still kept from that original modification. He would hold it up to the light, watching how it bent and reflected the lamplight, and remember the night he had gambled everything on an idea. The night desperation and skill and necessity had combined to create something that would outlast the war itself. The modification hadn't won the war. Millions of soldiers, fighting in thousands of battles, had done that. But it had changed something important. It had shown that even in the rigid hierarchy of military organization, individual initiative and technical expertise had value. It had proven that a sergeant with a broken scope and some mirror glass could impact the course of history. Not through heroic sacrifice, but through intelligent problem-solving. And perhaps, Viktor thought as he returned the mirror glass to its place in his watchmaker's toolkit, that was the most important lesson of all. Wars were won not just by those who were willing to die, but by those who were determined to think, to adapt, to find solutions where none seemed to exist. That was the legacy worth preserving, not just a technique for modifying scopes, but a philosophy of resourcefulness and intelligent adaptation that transcended any single conflict. The small piece of mirror glass sat in his toolkit, a reminder of desperate times and innovative solutions, of a frozen city where survival depended on precision, and of the truth that sometimes the most important contributions come not from following protocol, but from having the courage to break it when lives hang in the balance.